Hey everybody, and welcome to another edition of the Travis on Sports podcast. As always, I'm your host, Travis Tyler, here to discuss the latest news from around the sports world. It's Tuesday, April 19th, 2022. Skipped last week. Felt like there wasn't quite enough to do a full show last week, but we're back now, and today we're talking the Masters and Tiger Woods' return, the NBA playoffs, the NBA award finalists, the first 2 weeks or so of the MLB season, the first jersey advertising deal in Major League Baseball, the NHL playoff picture with just a few days left in the regular season, more NBA draft declarations and basketball transfer portal entries, the XFL's 8 head coaches for 2023, more legal issues for the Washington Commanders, a contract extension for one of the star NFL quarterbacks, and other NFL headlines from around the league. We start today with the Masters, played about 9 or 10 days ago. The winner ended up being Scottie Scheffler, who shot a 10 under for the 4 days. Rory McIlroy, Colin Morikawa, really hot on his heels, thanks to impressive Sunday rounds, and Cam Smith started his Sunday with the winning group and had a couple brutal shots on one of the early holes that he wasn't able to make up for. Otherwise, he would have been a lot closer and had a chance to take the whole thing. It also marked the return for Tiger Woods for the first time since his serious car accident last year. If you remember from the accident, his legs were in such bad shape he needed multiple surgeries, and no one was sure if he'd be able to play again or how well he'd be able to play again. And then over the weekend, he returned to the course and shot a 13 over at Augusta. The score isn't nearly as important as the fact that he was just out there, and it was great to see him playing, and we'll get to see how much he improves when he decides to participate in further tournaments. The NBA play-in games were last week. In the West, the Pelicans beat the Clippers and the Spurs for the 8 seed, and the Timberwolves landed the 7 seed. New Orleans is playing Phoenix, and Minnesota is playing Memphis. In the East, the Nets earned the 7th seed after beating Cleveland, and the Hawks landed the 8th spot after beating Cleveland and Charlotte. Atlanta plays the Miami Heat, and the Brooklyn Nets will play the Boston Celtics. And the playoffs started over the weekend. The Jazz and Mavericks, I believe that's the 4 and 5 matchup out west. I think it could be a 7-game series. Obviously, the appeal is Donovan Mitchell against Luka Doncic, but Doncic hasn't played yet in this series. The Mavs have still been able to find their way to a 1-1 tie heading to Utah for Game 3. In the regular season, they finished just 3 games apart and split the season series 2-2, so it's not a surprise that they're tied right now. Jalen Brunson and Spencer Dinwiddie have been the best players for Dallas, scoring over 20 points in each game, and Brunson had 41 in the second game. Donovan Mitchell has obviously been the star for the Jazz. He's gotten a lot of help from Bojan Bogdanovic this time around. Like I said, Brunson had 41 on Monday night, and Maxi Kleber came off the bench. He's a stretch big man, stretch 4. Shot 8 of 11 from three-point range and had 25 points in the game. The 2-7 matchup in the West is the Memphis Grizzlies and the Minnesota Timberwolves. Minnesota ended a long playoff drought by earning the 7th seed in the Western playing game. The Grizzlies are one of the more impressive young cores with Jaren Jackson Jr., John Morant, Dylan Brooks, Xavier Tillman, Desmond Bane, Kyle Anderson, Brandon Clark, Jarrett Culver. They've gone from playing in the play-in last year to the number 2 seed in the West this year, so that's a very impressive turnaround under Taylor Jenkins there. Minnesota stole Game 1 with Anthony Edwards scoring 36 points and Karl Anthony Towns scoring 29. I think that matchup in particular with Towns against Jaren Jackson Jr. and Steven Adams and Xavier Tillman and Brandon Clark and whatever other big guys they throw in there is going to be a very important matchup for who is able to come out on top every night. Game 2 will be played later tonight. The Raptors and Sixers are the 4-5 matchup in the East. The Raptors rallied to grab the number 5 seed. Their best players are Pascal Siakam and Fred VanVleet, but also Gary Trent Jr. and OG Anunoby have had great years as well, especially scoring the basketball. And Scotty Barnes, the rookie from Florida State, is in the Rookie of the Year conversation. And Chris Boucher, former Oregon big man, developmental guy, made his mark in the G League and finally got his chance to prove himself a couple years ago as a full-time NBA player, is just getting better and better every year. and he's always been a good defensive player. He's becoming a better and better offensive player every game. But the Philly roster is really stacked. You got James Harden, Tobias Harris, Joel Embiid, who won the scoring title. You got veterans off the bench like a Danny Green, a DeAndre Jordan, a Paul Millsap, and they've been getting big contributions from Tyrese Maxey and Matisse Thybulle. Thybulle, for this series, will not be able to play in games that are played in Toronto because he is not vaccinated against COVID. He only averages about 5-6 points per game, but he's a plus athlete and a very good and important defender for the Sixers. So far, Philly has a 2-0 lead and won the games rather handedly. Tyrese Maxey, surprisingly, has emerged as a legitimate scorer, and Toronto has some scorers on their team too, like I mentioned, but it's hard enough to compete with Harden, Embiid, and Harris, and then to have to additionally worry about Tyrese Maxey coming out and having these 20, 30-point games is just making things even more difficult. The Raptors really need to take one of those games at home. The 3-6 matchup in the West is the Nuggets and the Golden State Warriors. The Warriors looked more like their old selves, not totally their championship selves, but looked a lot better this year. Klay and Steph have been back. Draymond has missed some time this year, but when he's healthy, they've looked really good. Jonathan Kuminga has been their best rookie off the bench. You got guys contributing with 20-plus minutes in Otto Porter Jr., Kevon Looney, Damian Lee. You've had breakout years from Andrew Wiggins and Jordan Poole. You have 4 guys on the team that average over 17 points per game. Poole has had a couple 30-point games to start the postseason. Steph actually has been coming off the bench and had 34 in Game 2. For Denver, they've slid down in the standings from last year. Jokic playing like an MVP again, best player by far. But then you really don't know what you're going to get from everybody else, especially with Jamal Murray, who hasn't played all year from the knee injury he sustained in the playoffs last year. Don't know if he's going to be able to come back for this postseason. Will Barton, so far this series, has been their number 2 guy. Aaron Gordon hasn't really shown up in the playoff series so far. Monte Morris is inconsistent. Bones Highland could be an important guy as a rookie. He's averaging 10 points per game. You also have Michael Porter Jr. and Brent Forbes, who can be scoring guys off the bench. Forbes is more of a shooter, whereas Porter Jr. is more of a complete guy, can play inside and out. For me, the Warriors have more scoring threats, and they're the better outside shooting team. The Nuggets are very much a slashing and inside team with Nikola Jokic. And again, if Murray's able to return, that would be a boost for Denver. But so far, Curry, Poole, Green, Thompson, Wiggins have all been too much for the Nuggets defense to handle, and the Warriors are so far have just been simply too balanced and could make quick work in this series if Denver doesn't make some adjustments. And the Warriors have a 2-0 lead in this series, heading for Game 3 in Denver on Thursday. The Heat versus the Hawks, like I mentioned, the Hawks won the 8 seed through the play-ins. They are playing the number 1 seed Miami Heat. I think the Heat win this pretty easily because, they're possibly the deepest roster in the East. The Hawks really need Trae Young to keep them in games still right now, and he only had 8 in the first game, and they lost that one. Miami shooters, first off, their wings and their guards are more athletic and they're quicker to me than the wings for the Hawks, and it really showed in the first game where Miami's wings were shooting lights out and really weren't challenged very much. Game 2 is happening tonight. The Celtics and the Nets in the 2-7 matchup in the East. On paper, Brooklyn has the better roster, but Boston had a better regular season. And you look at Brooklyn, how do you end up as a 7 seed with 8 guys averaging at least 11 points per game, and 3 of those being over 22? You factor in that one of those guys in each of those categories was James Harden, so then you have 7 guys averaging over 11 points per game and 2 guys averaging over 22 points per game. The answer to that question is it's bad defense. Brooklyn's defense has been historically bad. You can see a lot of big nights from Jason Tatum, Jaylen Brown. Question for Brooklyn is, does Ben Simmons get to play at all in this series? He hasn't played all season. You have Durant and Irving and a couple other veterans like Patty Mills, Andre Drummond, LaMarcus Aldridge available for the Nets. Game 1, Boston won by a point, and there really wasn't much defense played. It was a 115-114 win. Jason Tatum hit a buzzer-beating layup on a cut. Durant and Irving were the only 2 Nets with more than 15 points. They combined for 62 points on the night. Goran Dragic and Nick Claxton were the only other two in double digits, whereas the Celtics had 4 guys score over 20 points, led by Tatum. They also had Al Horford go over 20, Marcus Smart, and Jaylen Brown. Game 2 will be tomorrow night, Wednesday, the 20th. The Bulls and Bucks will be an inter-division matchup that no one really expected to see in the 3-6 matchup. In the East, obviously the Bucks have a great team. Not much has changed from last year's championship team. But we're going to start with Chicago here. No one expected them to be in this position. Somehow, the odd combo of 2 guys that have very, very similar, if not identical, playing styles, and DeMar DeRozan and Zach LaVine playing together has worked, and they're the best 2 players on the team. You throw in some improved point guard play and some improved shooting from Lonzo Ball, even though he missed some of the season, Kobe White, and a big guy who can shoot in Nikola Vucevic, and as you add in Alex Caruso, suddenly your roster doesn't look so bad. It's not a team that's going to compete for much in the East right now, but it was good enough to make the playoffs in that conference. The Bucks are still easily the better team. You got Giannis Antetokounmpo, Chris Middleton, both All-Stars, both really hard to stop. You got another potential All-Star. I think he's been in a few All-Star games. Drew Holiday, very good point guard, strong scorer, strong defender, and then a really deep bench. That's the biggest thing here. Like, yeah, the Bucks have more star potential, sure, but the biggest advantage they have is they have a deeper bench of more advantages to attack the Bulls with. So I think it's pretty easy for the defending champion Bucks to survive round 1. Game 1 on Sunday, the Bulls rallied back from a large deficit to only lose by 7, but the game was never really as close as that final score indicated. Vucevic and DeRozan were the ones that had big games for Chicago, and Game 2 will be played on Wednesday night. The Suns and the Pelicans are the 1-8 matchup in the West. There's been improvement from the Pelicans, especially with CJ McCollum on the team, but I did think that the best matchup in terms of first-round upset against the Suns would be the Clippers, simply because they had more star power and athleticism to possibly make things into a series. You definitely like a group of, maybe Kawhi Leonard and Paul George are able to play, but aside from that, you add Norman Powell, Reggie Jackson, Marcus Morris, shooters in Luke Kennard and Terrence Mann, veteran front court guys that can score when called upon, in Ivica Zubac and Robert Covington. With Paul George and Kawhi involved, that could have been a series, and you especially would like the group of all those guys going up against Devin Booker, Chris Paul, DeAndre Ayton, Mikal Bridges, then the current New Orleans group of Jackson Hayes, CJ McCollum, Brandon Ingram, Devontae Graham, Herb Jones, Larry Nance Jr., Zion not playing. New Orleans earned it, sure, by beating the Clippers. I just think the Clippers would have been a more entertaining series. The Suns have the best record in the NBA. You could easily make the argument that they're one of the deepest teams in the league, and they have emerging young players mixed with some vets like Chris Paul. But the big thing for me is they're a very successful, very young team still overall. You got Devin Booker, Chris Paul, DeAndre Ayton, Jake Crowder, Mikal Bridges. It's hard to stop on its own, and then you add in 4 more double-digit scorers, and take into account that Phoenix is a team that plays up to 11 of their players at least 20 minutes per game. It's a big challenge because New Orleans definitely isn't able to go that deep with the same quality of play. The 2022 MLB season started April 7th and 8th, depending on which team you root for. We covered some of the things I was watching on the last show, but here's some notes and some of my thoughts from the first few games that we have seen. The AL East seems to be just about as we expected, and what we expected was everybody was going to challenge for that except for the Baltimore Orioles. The other 4 teams, the Yankees, the Blue Jays, the Red Sox, and the Rays, are all around 500 right now. They've played a couple series against each other, so they've kind of been beating each other up. And Baltimore is 3-7 so far this season. I think the White Sox are easily the best team in the AL Central because they're everybody knew they had that killer lineup, and their pitching is better than I thought it would be. It's not great, but it's definitely better. The bullpen still has some struggles, but you don't need, especially at this point, a lights-out bullpen when your lineup has 9 hitters that can absolutely destroy opposing pitching. Oakland, tore everything down, but they're currently sitting at 6-5 for what it's worth. Obviously, a long season, a long way to go, It's very, very early, obviously 11 games in a 162-game season, so, you got 151 games left. But with how much they tore it down, you would have expected them to be, 1-10, 0-11, around that range. Again, it's early, it's a long season. We'll see where that happens. The Angels